Hello, Doc here with a quick message. What you're about to see is a supercut of my take on something called ShatterVictim, a popular theory in the FNaF community that I made 2 videos on. I pretty much just put the 2 videos together in order to make one complete theory, so if you hear me later on refer to back to part 1, it means I'm just referring to earlier on in the video. Anywho, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. We have a lot to talk about today, so let's cut right to the chase. I think what we're going to discuss in this video solves almost everything in the original story of FNaF, that being games 1 all the way to UCN, including FNaF World. So with that in mind, I would like to bring up a little theory you might have heard of in the past, known as Dream Theory. I think at this point most of us are familiar with Dream Theory, but for those who somehow aren't, it was a popular theory made by MatPat way back when FNaF 4 first came out. Nowadays, it's most certainly not the case. After all, we are like 11 games deep now, not counting all the spin-offs. However, there's this other famous little thing in FNAF's history called the One Retcon that Scott Cawthon himself spoke of years ago, back around the time of Sister Location. A lot of people think that Dream Theory was the original intention of the series, and that the fan backlash of Dream Theory, plus the backlash of FNAF World at the time, encouraged Scott Cawthon to continue the franchise. Now, to be fair, I think it's possible that FNaF 4 was supposed to be the final chapter once upon a time, and that the bad reception to FNaF World did lead Scott Cawthon to developing Sister Location, and so on and so forth. However, I don't think Dream Theory was ever retconned. As a matter of fact, I don't think Dream Theory was ever the case. I think Dream Theory is the byproduct of FNaF 4's vague storytelling, and the clues that we were given being quite reasonably misinterpreted. So today we are going to be talking about what I believe was the actual intention of FNaF 4 and how it shapes the story of the entire series. Today, we are talking about ShatterVictim. Now right off the bat, I want to preface that ShatterVictim, like many theories in FNaF, has different variations and interpretations. I was lucky enough that I had the help of some other FNaF fans in the FNaF Theories Discord server when it came to understanding the topic. Shout out to Wake and LT for their assistance in helping me understand ShatterVictim. ShatterVictim is also one of those theories that has actually existed for quite a while, though I've rarely heard it talked about by most theorists. I'm hoping with this video that more people get to learn about ShatterVictim, and that it even helps theory crafting going forward. With that all out of the way, I think the best place to start with ShatterVictim would be, of course, FNaF 4. In its simplest form, I think the story of FNaF 4 is a story about 2 brothers. The crying child that we follow throughout the minigames between each night, and his older brother, who is generally agreed upon to be Michael Afton. That would make the crying child William Afton's youngest son, and throughout these minigames, the crying child is consistently tormented by Michael. We see Michael jump out at the crying child while wearing a Foxy mask pretty often, causing the poor kid to keel over and sob. All the while, a Freddy plush talks to the crying child, reassuring him and encouraging him to stay strong. The line, "tomorrow's another day," might ring a bell. Rather strangely, this Freddy plush seems to follow the crying child wherever he goes. In almost every scene, the plush can be found somewhere, even in the weirdest of places. Behind someone's car, in a storm drain, or even in the sunflower. The only place we don't physically see the plush is when the crying child is at the actual Fredbear's location, yet the crying child can still hear him. Putting that aside for the moment, this all culminates in Michael and his friends accidentally killing the crying child on his birthday. They drag him to the show stage in Fredbear's family diner before forcefully putting his head into Fredbear's mouth, and you know the rest.
Was that the bite of 87?
But, very clearly, the crying child doesn't instantly die here. He's actually taken to a hospital where he resides in a coma until his eventual passing, and this is where Dream Theory would usually come into play. Dream Theory proposes that as this poor kid is dying, he's having these horrible nightmares based on his experiences, hence the gameplay of FNaF 4. But what Dream Theory also says is that the 3 games prior to this one are all part of the crying child's imagination. I won't get too deep into that because it's old news at this point, and it doesn't necessarily matter. However, I will say that a lot of evidence for Dream Theory is also used for ShatterVictim, and it really just boils down to interpreting evidence in different ways. In the final 8-bit cutscene we see in FNaF 4, we see the crying child in this dark abyss with a single light illuminating him. With him are his so-called friends, including the plush Fredbear that's been with him the entire game. We can tell by the grey text that appears that it isn't just the plush that talks here, but that the scene actually starts with Michael Afton talking to his younger brother. Can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me. I'm sorry. Then the text becomes yellow again, and it's the plush speaking to us now. As Psychic Friend Fredbear talks, the other plushies slowly begin to fade away until only the Fredbear plush remains, but even he too disappears, leaving with those famous last words, "I will put you back together," followed by the sound of the crying child flatlining as his own life fades. But that's the story of the minigames. What about the actual gameplay? Hindsight is 2020, of course, and the actual gameplay of FNAF 4 is oddly detached from the story we just talked about, believe it or not. Originally, we all thought that we played as the crying child, considering we do play as him in the minigames, though with recent revelations from the books and what we see in Sister Location, all our original notions have been totally flipped. For example, the bedroom that we defend ourselves in is actually most likely not the crying child's actual room, but is actually part of an experiment chamber connected to the Sister Location bunker, where William was carrying out fear experiments using Scarecrow-esque fear toxin. Does that mean the gameplay is actually real and not just some dream? Believe it or not, the gameplay of FNAF 4 is still a nightmare, it's just not the crying child's nightmare. It's Michael's. During the gameplay of FNAF 4, you can hear phone guy's first ever phone call from the first game. Along with that, in the Survivor logbook, Michael draws what looks to be Nightmare Fredbear. Or is it? In the trailer for FNAF 4, we see the tagline, "What have you brought home?" And in the Survivor logbook, we can find a rather interesting prompt that we're given to work off of. Quote, "I'd only been on the night shift for about a week, but I was so relieved to be switched over to the day shift. There's a lot of stress working 12 AM to 6 AM. My boss had told me that the animatronics were acting strangely, almost aggressive towards staff, but I wasn't about to let that scare me off. After work, I had an unsettling feeling that I was being followed home," end quote. So right off the bat, this is reminiscent of what Phone Guy tells us in FNAF 2 about the toy animatronics acting hostile and that Jeremy is to be moved to the day shift. Going back to FNAF 4 for a moment, I would like to once again credit Watch from the FNAF Theories Discord server for this little fun fact. You'll be able to see his post on screen as I read from it. I'm going to be paraphrasing slightly. Watch states in this post that Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare share the same AI in FNAF 4. You can even see this in the radar mode where Nightmare uses Nightmare Fredbear's icon. There's just a value that the game stores to know when to have Nightmare Fredbear swap to Nightmare, making them just reskins of each other with a few AI changes. He also goes on to say this value that tells the game when to swap them out, it's called Shadow, making Nightmare a shadow version of Nightmare Fredbear. Now that's pretty telling, but it doesn't end there. Again, thank you to Watch for this amazing information. He goes on to say that the shadow value has another use to help determine what night it is during the game. For example, if the value is set to 1, then the night is set to 7, and if it's set to 2, then the night becomes the 8th night. Nightmare will only activate if this value is above 0. That's interesting, but Watch goes on to propose a question. So what initially sets the shadow value for the game to determine the night, followed by the answer, the Nightmare Mode and 2020 mode buttons, which are also called Shadow Freddy in the files. I mean, when it comes to vague confirmation in FNAF, it doesn't really get more clear than that. All this to say that the mysterious Nightmare is without a doubt Shadow Freddy. So to answer the question, what have you brought home, we have to look at the game files of FNAF 4 and that prompt from the Survivor logbook. It's important to keep in mind that the Survivor logbook was/is owned by Michael Afton, and it's one of the only pieces of FNAF media where we learned so much about the character. We also know that Shadow Freddy was present in the FNAF 1 location at some point, a la the FNAF 3 Follow Me minigames, so what's the point here? Point being that I believe after Mike was fired from the FNAF 1 location, Shadow Freddy follows Michael home and is possibly even the reason why Michael is having these vivid nightmares of William Afton's fear experiments. After all, his name is Nightmare in the game, so to me personally that means he is the supernatural element coming into Mike's dreams and, again, possibly even causing them. It's a smaller point, and much less substantiated, but as mentioned before, Mike does draw Nightmare Fredbear in the logbook. But if you look at Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare, you'll quickly realize that they look extremely similar. Quite literally, the only difference is their color palette. They even share the same AI in FNAF 4. We can even take it another step further and point out that if you look at Shadow Freddy in FNAF 2 and FNAF 3, his appearance is mighty similar to Golden Freddy from FNAF 2. For all intents and purposes, Shadow Freddy is like a mirrored version of Fredbear. So with that in mind, what if the illustration Mike draws in the logbook isn't actually Nightmare Fredbear, but Nightmare? Now why does that matter? It kinda doesn't, to be honest. We already established that Nightmare is Shadow Freddy via more concrete evidence, though that revelation is going to be our baseline going forward. You might be wondering how this all ties into ShatterVictim, and for the moment we haven't necessarily gotten to the real juice of the theory yet. However, I thought it was important to differentiate / explain the gameplay of FNAF 4 before we move on to the next question. Now that we know that Nightmare is Shadow Freddy, what are the Shadow Animatronics? The Shadow Animatronics were originally introduced in FNAF 2 and made a subsequent appearance in FNAF 3. As we just discussed, Shadow Freddy is also technically in FNAF 4, but in FNAF 2, Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are rare encounters, the latter of which crashes your game. However, in FNAF 3, they have a much more important role. Shadow Freddy is the entity that lures the classic animatronics to the safe room so that William Afton can dismantle them, while Shadow Bonnie, on the other hand, is a little bit more strange. He's one of the sprites you play as in the Happiest Day minigames you need to complete in order to get the good ending of FNAF 3. But why? Why do either of them do this? Well, let me break it down for you. Some say that Shadow Freddy is almost akin to an ally for William Afton, hence why he helps lead the classic animatronics to their doom in the Follow Me minigames. On the opposite side of that, Shadow Bonnie seems to be a little bit nicer, so to speak. After all, he does bring some delicious cake to one of the ghostly souls seen in his respective minigame. There's also the elephant in the room known as FNAF AR, where if you collect too much Dark Remnant, which I'm willing to bet is just Agony, Shadow Bonnie will appear and you have to fend him off. That would suggest that seemingly Shadow Bonnie is connected to Remnant, or rather Agony. We've seen this before in the books actually. Creatures that seem to be manifestations of pain and suffering, whether it be specific persons or the literal trauma surrounding an event such as the missing child's incident. In the very first FF story, we explore the 1985 Freddy's location where the main character Oswald meets what seems to be a version of William Afton, or rather a monstrous version of Spring Bonnie. Into the Pit is a retelling of that horrific incident, a memory that Oswald is able to step into via the Ball Pit. The yellow rabbit we see throughout the Into the Pit isn't actually William Afton, but a byproduct created by the agony of the missing children's incident. With that in mind, I believe that Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are byproducts of Agony. Again, let me break it down for you. We should all be familiar with the MCI. It's that one event in the FNAF series that is consistently and constantly brought up time and time again. It's in the games, it's in the books, and it's in the movie. However, there's actually another incident that may or may not, most likely not, hold some significance to the story. That being the DCI, also known as the Dead Children incident from FNAF 2. For those who aren't aware or might have forgotten, William Afton does actually kill more kids after the MCI. After being moved to the day shift in FNAF 2, William puts on a yellow Springlock suit and game ends a few more kids, presumably the kids who go on to possess the toy animatronics. So we have two traumatic incidences where 5 children are killed by William Afton. But it's also worth noting that although he is commonly connected to the Spring Bonnie costume in particular, the Spring Bonnie suit would still be in the back room of the 1985 location during the events of FNAF 2. In FNAF 3, Phone Guy says this.
Hello. This is just to inform all employees that due to budget restrictions, the previously mentioned safe rooms are being sealed at most locations, including this one. Work crews will be here most of the day today, constructing a false wall over the old door face. Nothing is being taken out beforehand, so if you left anything inside, then it's your own fault. Management also requests that this room not be mentioned to family, friends, or insurance representatives. Thanks again, and remember to smile. You are the face of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza.
It's very possible that the MCI incident is what caused the safe rooms to be closed, and with that, the Spring Bonnie suit would be left there for years. Which makes sense, considering the next time we know for certain it was used is in the FNAF 3 Follow Me minigames, where it was severely worn down. Obviously, we know what happened there. So when talking about the DCI, it's actually more likely that William used the Golden Freddy suit. That might sound weird, considering Spring Bonnie is so typically representative of William Afton, though it's not unwarranted. As a matter of fact, in the Silver Eyes novel, William Afton wears the Golden Freddy suit when kidnapping Michael Brooks, so we already have precedent for him using that costume. So for the MCI, William uses the bunny suit to aid him in killing 5 children, and then for the DCI, he uses the bear suit to help him kill 5 more kids. You might be able to see where I'm going with this. I believe that these Shadow animatronics are the byproduct of the agony surrounding both of these events. I believe Shadow Bonnie was most likely created by the MCI and Shadow Freddy was created by the DCI. I think you could make an argument for a vice versa scenario where the origins of the shadows are switched. Very notably, Shadow Bonnie does appear in the form very similar to Toy Bonnie. However, it's also worth noting that the toy animatronics technically existed prior to FNAF 2 in the form of literal toys. And that brings me to my next point, or rather, it brings us back to the beginning of this discussion, ShatterVictim. In FNAF 4, as the crying child is being dragged to the show stage by Michael and his posse, we can see Fredbear and Spring Bonnie shadows being casted from the stage. Quite interestingly, these shadows are the same color as Shadow Bonnie from the FNAF 3 Happiest Day minigames. FNAF 4 is also the same game where we see those toy figurine versions of the toy animatronics, meaning that the toy animatronics were most likely based off these figures. If you're familiar with Dream Theory, you might recall Chica's beak being a detail of that theory. It was something that Scott even called out way back when. Dream Theory deposits that the reason Chica is missing her beak in FNAF 2 is because that's how the crying child remembers Toy Chica. In FNAF 4, when he sees the toys, the Chica figure is also missing its beak, hence the connection there. Right idea, but again, I don't think Dream Theory was ever the intention. I think the reason these Shadow animatronics look the way they do, and by extension, why Toy Chica is missing her beak in FNAF 2, is because of the crying child. Earlier I mentioned something called Agony, and I said that the Shadow animatronics are byproducts of the agony surrounding the MCI and DCI. And I do think that's true, but what is agony in FNAF? It's not just a sensation, it's a powerful emotion that extends to the point of being supernatural. Hence characters like Pit Trap, Eleanor, and the Shadow animatronics. In FNAF 4, the crying child is in immense agony. This poor guy is crying every 5 seconds and he's being tormented by his own brother. The characters that he calls his friends are being used against him to terrify him. William, he's certainly not winning any Father of the Year awards. He's not even around to watch his own kids. The crying child is having breakdowns constantly to the point he's pouring his heart out wherever he goes, because he is endlessly scared for his own life. With that in mind, I believe that many of the events and details of the Five Nights at Freddy's story are influenced by the crying child's agony. I believe that, after his death, the crying child's soul was shattered into pieces. But that begs the question, where did the pieces go? To answer that question, I think I should explain what the shadow part of ShatterVictim refers to. As I just mentioned, ShatterVictim refers to the crying child's soul being shattered, but more specifically, it refers to his pieces being split between the 5 core animatronics, that being Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and of course, Golden Freddy. More specifically, it's not the animatronics themselves, but the souls of William Afton's victims that inhabit them. There's also variations to this idea, of course, that include the puppet. We'll put that aside for now and talk about it later. I also want to point out that there's another theory by the name of Memory Victim, which is very similar to ShatterVictim in a lot of ways, and much like Dream Theory, shows evidence and points with ShatterVictim. However, again, it just boils down to interpreting evidence in a different fashion. Instead of the crying child's pieces being split across the aforementioned 5 characters, it's his quote-unquote memory that is split across the entire timeline of the series, almost kind of like a curse, so to speak. Which, actually, that might have more merit than I think. But alas, that'll have to do for this video. There's still a lot we have to go over, and I think it's best if we split this up into at least a few parts. Today we discussed what I think FNAF 4 is and what these Shadow animatronics are. 2 things that I think are already pretty big topics to begin with. We only briefly touched on the idea that ShatterVictim proposes, but in part 2 I promised that we'll be going deeper into that idea. Until then, I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to leave your thoughts below if you have any. This is one of those theories that I'm really interested in seeing what people think, and I hope I'm doing it some justice. Once again, thank you for watching, and I can't wait to see you again. Peace out. Hello everyone, welcome back to the eternal pain and suffering known as FNAF theorizing. It's been a while since we last spoke, mostly because I'm really bad at time management still, and I'm still trying to figure out the best way to go about making these videos. I'm not going to get into what I've been thinking about doing in that regard, but I will say that I'm hoping to do these discussions and theories more frequently in the future. Nevertheless, last we left off, we were talking about a fairly known topic in the FNAF community called ShatterVictim, and today we'll be continuing that discussion. If you're not familiar with ShatterVictim or what we talked about previously, I recommend watching my last FNAF theory video, which you can find in the description of this video. Part 1 serves as my basis as we go forward deeper into ShatterVictim, and it also has a lot of context for what we'll be talking about henceforth. As with anything in FNAF, there's always different facets and nuances to this sort of thing, especially something as extensive as ShatterVictim. And this is only my take on it. Something I've always personally set out to do when it comes to theory crafting is that I want to open up a discussion most of all. I want to see what other people might have to say or what their take on a theory might be. So, as per usual, if this theory is of any interest to you, I'd love to hear what you have to say, so feel free to use the comments down below. But beyond that, I think it's time we picked up where we left off in part 1. If you recall, in part 1, I brought up that emotions in FNAF can be a very powerful thing, most notably when it comes to the concept of agony. I believe that the agony of the crying child has been impacting the story of FNAF, and in that previous theory, I brought up some examples. I'd like to discuss other instances where it seems the crying child's agony seems to impact the story, so let's talk about another rather strange detail in FNAF 4, that being Mangle. Within the crying child's home in FNAF 4, we can see bits and pieces of what is clearly Funtime Foxy, and yes, I do mean Funtime Foxy. That is the actual official name of the new version of Foxy in FNAF 2, take that as you will. Of course, speaking of FNAF 2, that is the game where we are first introduced to the Mangle, and we learn that Funtime Foxy is apparently a take-apart, put-back-together attraction because kids are horrible, horrible little creatures. Interesting wording, right? Take apart and put back together. That jumped out to me too, but oddly enough, that's only one part of this puzzle. The obvious question here is, why the heck is Mangle in FNAF 4? The fact he's in what is presumably Elizabeth Afton's bedroom, of all places, is strangely not that important. What is important, however, is the fact that Funtime Foxy here is in pieces. Let me ask you this. Why Foxy? Out of all the toy animatronics, why is Foxy the one that kids decide to rip apart? Personally, I've always found Balloon Boy to be very puntable, yet apparently nobody has a problem with him. Well, we've already established one thing that the crying child's agony infects in FNAF 2, that being Toy Chica's beak. So what if we apply that logic to Mangle? In FNAF 4, the crying child sees the Toy Chica figure missing its beak. So in FNAF 2, Toy Chica loses her beak. In FNAF 4, the crying child sees Funtime Foxy in pieces in his sister's room. So in FNAF 2, Funtime Foxy is torn apart and in pieces. Now the question still remains as to why Funtime Foxy is actually in FNAF 4. I think it boils down to two possibilities. A, it is just another toy, much like the other figures we see of the toy animatronics, only this one is in Elizabeth Afton's possession. Or B, it is pieces of the actual Funtime Foxy in its early stages of development. Now, that in of itself comes with its own can of worms, because that could mean that William had a hand in making the toy animatronics. But, to be fair, there was also a better-known Funtime Foxy in Sister Location, which we know for certain was made by William Afton. Again, that's a whole other discussion. Sorry, English major here. Neither here nor there either way. In any case, we've covered a lot so far. We've talked about what FNAF 4 is, we've talked about what the Shadow animatronics are, and we've even touched upon the general idea of ShatterVictim. But I don't think I've done it justice just yet. There's something I brought up multiple times in part 1 of this theory already, but I haven't really talked about it in depth yet. That being the Happiest Day minigames from FNAF 3 and FNAF World. The Happiest Day minigames have always been pretty weird when it comes to FNAF's story. Compared to anything else in the series, the way you get the good ending of FNAF 3 is definitely pretty odd. To access BB's Air Adventure, you have to click on a drawing of Balloon Boy in the cameras, and to play Mangle's quest, you have to click on the buttons of an arcade machine in a certain order. Generally, all the mini-games follow a similar idea where you have to do fairly meta gameplay steps in order to unlock the secret mini-games. Again, for example, on night 3, in order to play Chica's Party, you have to search for shadow cupcakes in the cameras and click on them. In total, the characters that you play as in these minigames are Balloon Boy, Toy Chica, Mangle, Golden Freddy, Shadow Bonnie, and lastly, the Puppet. It's always been strange as to why these are the specific characters that we play as. I mentioned before that ShatterVictim proposes that the pieces of the crying child's soul are splintered between the 5 missing children's souls, and possibly even the Puppet. So wouldn't it make more sense if we played as those characters in these minigames? Well, that would have certainly helped ShatterVictim's case, but obviously that isn't the case. However, that doesn't mean that this specific selection of characters doesn't have meaning when it comes to the crying child. I mentioned already the influence crying child's Agony might have had over Toy Chica and Mangle in FNaF 2, but if you're familiar with Dream Theory and FNaF 4 in general, you might recall that the crying child briefly meets another kid on his way home from Fredbear's, a kid that has a striking resemblance to the lovable Balloon Boy. In part 1, we also talked about how the crying child's Agony might have influenced the Shadow Animatronics, or at the very least, Shadow Bonnie in particular, considering he is the one you play as in the glitch minigame. Golden Freddy, or rather Fredbear, is probably the most straightforward, being that Fredbear is the animatronic that took a bite out of the poor kid's head. Some interpretations of ShatterVictim would propose that the sprites we play as in these minigames are the souls of the missing children having taken shape as different fragments of the crying child's memory, and that the actual Happiest Day minigame is the children coming together to finally give the crying child that birthday he unfortunately never got. To an extent, I do think that is the case. I do think Happiest Day is the birthday party that the crying child never got to celebrate because, you know, he died the first time. But I'm starting to think it has less to do with the MCI and more so the crying child himself. Enter FNaF World. Yeah, we're bringing FNaF World into this. In FNaF World, you regularly talk to Fredbear on your journey throughout the game. He's basically the first friendly face you see. Though if you wait a few seconds after he's done talking, it's revealed there's a little bit under the surface than what this cheery, happy-go-lucky game might lead you to believe. Fredbear was suddenly turned into a pixelated version of himself that closely resembles the Fredbear plush from FNaF 4, and throughout the game he sends you on a mission to find the clocks, which we will get to soon. But what I want to point out first is some of the things that Glitchbear says during his dialogue. There was a task for you to complete. You have to leave breadcrumbs for him to help him find his way. One thing is true, nothing here is as it seems. If you have succeeded in setting the clocks, then your true goal will be revealed once you have the key. Throughout the game, Glitchbear has a few lines like this, seemingly hinting that the world we're playing in is a mere deception, and we're puppets whose strings are being pulled on by an overseeing villain. When we interact with the so-called clocks Glitchbear sends us to find, we're met with simplistic mini-games that seem to reference back to FNaF 3's secret mini-games. In one mini-game, we push BB into a box. In another mini-game, we push 4 cupcakes into 4 boxes. Then in the next clock minigame, we have to step on a specific button that displays the wall code from FNaF 3. You might be seeing the theme here. In each of these clock minigames, we're, in some fashion, seemingly setting up the steps or characters that are used to get the good ending of FNaF 3. I should note that I use the term good ending loosely, because it's technically not referred to as the good ending, more so it's just the end, though the point still stands. Glitchbear already told us what we're doing here, and what is seemingly our actual purpose. That being to leave breadcrumbs for him to help him find his way. And considering our mission is to find and complete these clock puzzles, we can assume these are the breadcrumbs in question. Completing this task gives us the clock ending where a pair of beady yellow eyes peers at us from the darkness. The speaker echoes words similar to that of plush Fredbear from FNaF 4. We are still your friends. Do you believe that? But then he continues, the pieces are in place for you. All you have to do is find them. Rest. It is my belief that FNAF World, specifically the Glitch Barrel Clock route of the game, serves as a setup for the secret minigames we play in FNAF 3, which eventually leads to Happiest Day. This setup consists of the Crying Child's shattered fragments, characters, and memories that we've already talked about before. I don't think we're playing as the children's souls in FNAF 3's secret minigames. I think we're playing as the spiritual pieces of the Crying Child after said pieces have been laid out for his soul to find. At the same time, I think the souls that we give cake to in these minigames are the souls of the missing children that then join the Happiest Day birthday party. Then, and only then, is the Crying Child able to be set free because all his friends, and the splinters of his memories that they carry, are finally united. Yeah, I know that was probably a lot to digest. Take a minute if you want. I'll wait. It's okay. A topic such as this is always a little bit difficult to discuss or explain because it's one of those ideas that borderlines on being a meta concept. Nowadays, when it comes to FNAF, a lot of us are used to having a science behind the supernatural. We have things like Remnant and Agony and AI programming and so many different methods for these things to function that something such as ShatterVictim, which has quite a few elements of detached realism, can be hard to get across. So I want to try and clear up a few things that might have been difficult to understand, and touch on some things I purposefully didn't go into detail yet. I think the whole Shadow Bonnie, Chica's Beak, Mangle, and etc. is fairly easy to grasp. These aspects being splinters of the Crying Child, or at the very least, things that are influenced by his fragments/memory. I think that makes enough sense, but I also mentioned that the core 5 classics carry pieces of the Crying Child with them, specifically pieces of his memory most likely. Now with that in mind, you can argue that these sprites from the FNAF 3 minigames are those MCI children, and that each fragment, quote unquote, here represents a child. And that is a fair interpretation. My only gripe with that is the fact that we, as the sprite, are giving cake to what is also a lost soul. That's why I opted to explain these sprites as the fragments of the Crying Child instead of the MCI souls. There's something else I neglected to mention that is also important, that being the puppet and this little girl the Crying Child can talk to in FNAF 4. On his way home, the Crying Child meets a girl with ponytails and green eyes. When he talks to her, she says this: "You'd better watch out. I hear they come to life at night, and if you die, they hide your body and never tell anyone." Very clearly, it seems to be in reference to what we've come to often hear from ye fungi of old. The animatronics come to life at night and they try and stuff you in an animatronic, supposedly because they think you're an endoskeleton without its suit on. Now, there's been many different theories and reasons as to why the animatronics actually do this. Most likely, it's not for the reason fungi states, of course. Some might say that they attack the Night God because they think the Night God is William Afton. Others might say they are hostile towards adults specifically because it was an adult that misled and killed them. Or perhaps they are simply restless spirits who don't get along with the living and like to make people endure the same tragic fate that they did. Ultimately, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, but what if, once again, the reason they do what they do is because of the Crying Child? Again, we've already established how this dude's agony is all over the place, and once again, if we're saying his memory is influencing so many things, what if it's this moment from Crying Child's past that encourages that behavior from the animatronics? Ultimately, it doesn't necessarily matter. At the end of the day, you can come up with a fair few valid reasons as to why the animatronics are violent, and it also depends on the game you're playing. For example, in Sister Location, we directly hear from Michael that the Funtimes thought that Mike was his father, but that doesn't necessarily translate to every other game either. Essentially, the purpose this idea does serve is to further accentuate the point that the Crying Child's agony, quite possibly, is infecting and influencing quite a few things throughout the series. As for the puppet, I mentioned before in part 1 that there were variations to ShatterVictim that can include the puppet, and the infamous dream theory also tied the Crying Child to the puppet as well. The tear streaks, the striped shirt, even the position the Crying Child is in, which strikingly resembles the position of that silhouette of the puppet in FNAF 3's secret minigames. After all, we do play as the puppet in Happiest Day, and one could argue that the tear streaks that stream down the puppet's face are another example of the Crying Child's agony, once again influencing a character's physical appearance. All in all, the puppet is an aspect to ShatterVictim I think you can take or leave depending on what you want to believe. The second to last thing I want to bring up is Plush Fredbear, because this is one of those details that make ShatterVictim a little bit tricky. Granted, it doesn't outright disprove the theory, though it is one of those aspects that's a pain, to say the least. Ever since Sister Location came out and we saw Plush Fredbear sitting on the desk of William Afton's secret private room, it's been theorized that William was the one actually talking to the crying child throughout FNAF 4, possibly as a means to keep tabs on his youngest son because he knew the little guy was having a tough time, put simply.
Was that
The idea would be that he is trying to morally support and comfort his son via this Fredbear plush nanny cam system that he's set up. It's also possible that William could have had much more sinister reasons for spying on his own son. Something along the lines of the crying child perhaps witnessing something he shouldn't have, but that's neither here nor there. Whatever the case may be, that would mean that William has hid these plushies in a fair few places, public places even. Not only that, but the crying child hears Plush Fredbear even when the actual plush isn't around, such as when he's at the diner. I do think that Plush Fredbear is a figment of the crying child's imagination, possibly an imaginary friend that is given life through the crying child's immensely powerful Agony. After all, we do see him in FNAF World, so what is the Plush Fredbear in Sister Location? I think that the plush we see in SL is part of William Afton's fear experiments. I think that the reason William Afton was carrying out those experiments was because he was trying to replicate what happened to the crying child, hence why he used fear gas to terrorize his subjects in an attempt to recreate what happened to his youngest son. We've all been thinking that this map in the break room means that Sister Location was connected to Fredbear's family diner. I don't think so. I think that this is yet another experiment chamber adjacent to Sister Location, much like the FNAF 4 bedroom and plush trap hallway. I mean, let's be real, why wouldn't it be? It would actually be weirder for it not to be a recreation of Fredbear's, considering the two aforementioned places are now inferred to actually be part of the Sister Location facility. A little bit more of a stretch, but what if the reason Afton killed the MCI kids is because it was all part of his plan to put his son back together? Think about it. We've talked about how the crying child seems to attach himself to certain things, and how his agony affects the series. William Afton kills 5 kids, stuffs their bodies in the characters the crying child refers to as his friends, bodies of which are never found. Remember when I said the MCI victims carry pieces of the crying child? Well, this might very well lend credence to that idea. But wait, there's more. Just one more thing. At this point, we've kind of come to terms with Molten Freddy / Ennard being made up of the MCI. That would mean that the Funtime animatronics from Sister Location house the remnant and souls of the MCI, which eventually combine themselves together to form the aforementioned eldritch entity known as Ennard. Remind me, what was that promise again? I will put you back together. And what does Michael say in his custom night speech? Granted, he's talking about Elizabeth in that moment, but if we're saying the crying child is connected to the MCI spirits so heavily, and William's promise to the crying child was that he'd put him back together, you can kind of see what I'm getting at. In a very roundabout way, Molten Freddy is that promise fulfilled. Molten Freddy is all the pieces of the crying child finally brought together, now brought to a place where the plan is to finally end years of torment and suffering, a la FNAF 6. I know that the latter half of this theory was a little bit more speculative, though I think it fits the line of thinking that ShatterVictim proposes. Personally, considering I now wholeheartedly believe Dream Theory was never the case, I can confidently say I think ShatterVictim, or at least something very close to what ShatterVictim is, was most likely Scott Cawthon's intention with FNAF 4 and, by extension, FNAF World. I know I said Molten Freddy was the last piece of evidence that I had up my sleeve, but there's just one tiny little thing I think deserves just a little bit of our attention.
But I'll tell you, he did a video on that box, and he kind of said that he thinks the contents of the box changed over the years. You know, and I bet nobody gave that a whole lot of thought, but I saw that and I was like, he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. The contents of that box have changed over the years because, you know, it's for that very reason. It's because, you know, of what I was intending the game to be when it happened, and then after the reaction of it, I was like, I need to craft this into something better for the people who see this as important, and that and that kind of indirectly does change the contents of the box, because it changes the contents of everything that came before. Yeah, so I just thought that was an interesting observation on his part.
Yeah.
You know, when I released the first game over a year ago, I was amazed at how quickly everyone found every bit of lore and story. Then the same happened with Part 2. Fans and YouTubers dug in and found everything. Game Theory did an incredible video on Part 2, getting almost everything right. Then Part 3 came out, and once again, the story was uncovered by the community. It seemed that there was nothing I could hide. But then I released Part 4, and somehow, no one, not a single person, found the pieces. The story remains completely hidden. I guess most people assume that I filled the game with random Easter eggs this time. I didn't. What's in the box? It's the pieces put together. But the bigger question is, would the community accept it that way? This was a Steam post Scott Cawthon made way back in 2015 around the time of the Halloween update. I think a fitting conclusion to this video is to briefly talk about one of FNAF's biggest mysteries, that being the box. Truth be told, I don't think the box is much of a mystery. Now, to be fair, it's not like we're ever going to get a straight answer as to what the box really is. Is it something literal, or symbolic, or spiritual, or what? What the box is exactly, I don't think that's important, but to be fair, I don't think anyone ever did. It's always been what's inside the box people were curious about. But if the box is something much more metaphysical, we'll say, then that would mean the contents of it are most likely equally not literal. We already have a broad answer for what the box contains. It's the pieces put together. It's the pieces put together. It's the pieces put together. You probably know what I'm getting at least to some extent. And I could go in depth into what I think that might mean, but I actually want to leave that up to you. I think the box is the answer to FNAF, but much like anything and everything in this franchise, everybody has their own answers. Now, Scott Cawthon probably has the definitive answer somewhere, and it's probably in that box, but would the community accept it? At this point, honestly, maybe. Some people just really want straight answers, but whatever the case may be, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Thank you again to the people in the FNAF Theories Discord server that helped me understand ShatterVictim, and of course, thank you for watching. Feel free to leave your thoughts, feelings, opinions, and death threats below if you feel inclined. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did because, honestly, this is the theory that elevated me to FNAF Nirvana. But that aside, thank you again for watching, and I can't wait to see you next time. Peace out. Yeah, by the way, this script was written a few months ago. That's how bad I am at time management. Lo and behold, between now and then, we did get an answer for the box. So there goes that out the window. Clearly, Scott Cawthon truly is omnipotent, because he apparently read my mind and felt inclined to prove me wrong. So yeah, that happened. Still, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you around. Peace out. Again.